What about this one? Anyone? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of the name Sarojini Naidu. Well, now that we've learned who these people are, every one of them had something in common. Could you tell me what that is? They were all professionals. Each and every one of these people was a professional, gave up a career and answered the call to service. Let's try and find out what their professions are. What do you think Rajiv Gandhi ji did before he became Prime Minister of India? Well, late Rajiv Gandhi ji was a commercial pilot. Iron Man of India, Sardar Patel, was a barrister. Dr. Ambedkar was one of India's most eminent lawyers, but he was also an economist. Apart from being a very accomplished author, Pandit Nehru was also a lawyer. Dr. Manmohan Singh was an economist. In fact, he's one of the most qualified prime ministers. Sarojini Naidu was a very accomplished author and poet. It's professionals like them who built India, and it's professionals like you who build India. Be a professional for progress. Join the movement and be a professional for Congress. Join the All India Professionals Congress. Hi, I'm Alim, and as we're celebrating 75 years of India's independence, I have a few portraits here I'd like to show you. They are some of India's tallest and greatest leaders, essentially the people who built modern India. I'm going to point to them, and if you can tell me who they are. Starting with the first one. Any clues?
I think Rajiv Gandhi.
This is indeed Rajiv Gandhi, a former Prime Minister of India.
That's Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel.
Absolutely correct.
That's Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Indeed, the father of the Indian Constitution.
That's Pandit Jwala Nehru.
Nehru ji was in fact India's first Prime Minister.
That's Dr. Manmohan Singh.
One of the most intellectual Prime Ministers India has ever had. What about this one? Anyone? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of the name Sarojini Naidu. Well, now that we've learned who these people are, every one of them had something in common. Could you tell me what that is? They were all professionals. Each and every one of these people was a professional, gave up a career and answered the call to service. Let's try and find out what their professions are. What do you think Rajiv Gandhi ji did before he became Prime Minister of India? Well, late Rajiv Gandhi ji was a commercial pilot. Iron Man of India, Sardar Patel, was a barrister. Dr. Ambedkar was one of India's most eminent lawyers, but he was also an economist. Apart from being a very accomplished author, Pandit Nehru was also a lawyer. Dr. Manmohan Singh was an economist. In fact, he's one of the most qualified prime ministers. Sarojini Naidu was a very accomplished author and poet. It's professionals like them who built India, and it's professionals like you who build India. Be a professional for progress. Join the movement and be a professional for Congress. Join the All India Professionals Congress. Hi, I'm Alim, and as we're celebrating 75 years of India's independence, I have a few portraits here I'd like to show you. They are some of India's tallest and greatest leaders, essentially the people who built modern India. I'm going to point to them, and if you can tell me who they are. Starting with the first one. Any clues?
I think Rajiv Gandhi.
This is indeed Rajiv Gandhi, a former Prime Minister of India.
That's Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel.
Absolutely correct.
That's Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Indeed, the father of the Indian Constitution. Well, I'm sure you've all heard of the name Sarojini Naidu. Well, now that we've learned who these people are. Every one of them had something in common. Could you tell me? Well, late Rajiv Gandhi ji was a commercial pilot. Iron Man of India, Sardar Patel, was a barrister. Dr. Ambedkar was one of India's most eminent lawyers, but he was also an economist. Apart from being a very accomplished author, Pandit Nehru was also a lawyer. Dr. Manmohan Singh was an economist. In fact, he's one of the most qualified prime ministers. Sarojini Naidu was a very accomplished author and poet. It's professionals like them who built India, and it's professionals like you who build India. Be a professional for progress. Join the movement and be a professional for Congress. Join the All India Professionals Congress. Hi, I'm Alim, and as we're celebrating 75 years of India's independence, I have a few portraits here I'd like to show you. They are some of India's tallest and greatest leaders, essentially the people who built modern India. I'm going to point to them, and if you can tell me who they are. Starting with the first one. Any clues?
I think Rajiv Gandhi.
This is indeed Rajiv Gandhi, a former Prime Minister of India.
That's Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel.
Absolutely correct.
That's Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Indeed, the father of the Indian Constitution.
That's Pandit Jwala Nehru.
Nehru ji was in fact.
Okay, if I can ask all our friends and colleagues to settle down. We have a distinguished visitor who, in addition to everything else, had to fly through the night to be with us, and he is showing great good grace in allowing us to go ahead with the previously scheduled program. Air India, I'm afraid, delayed his flight by 12 hours, and he's thankfully not showing any visible ब्रेक में कर सकते हैं जो कुछ आप कहना चाहते थे या फोटो लेना चाहते थे तो बाद में करेंगे आइए बैठिए Come everyone, sit down. I don't think Raghuram Rajan needs any introduction. He is one of the most distinguished economists in the world, as young Alim pointed out. He has served all the leading international institutions at the highest levels as their chief economic advisor. He has served as the governor of our Reserve Bank, and he has served our own government before that as chief economic advisor. So he not only understands economics as a well-regarded professor, but is also somebody who has been a practitioner in trying to apply his economic ideas to the real world, and in particular to the realities of our country. I'm going to invite Raghuram Rajanji to make his remarks in the lecture format. He could go to the podium perhaps and speak to us all. And then I will engage him in a brief conversation, following which we will have a conversation, all of us, with him, so that those of you who have questions about what he's going to say are invited to send the questions in writing. We will then, and with your names obviously, we will call out whatever number of questions we have time for, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on how good your questions are. We'll call out the people's names and then you will get a mic to ask them. We're trying to keep some control of how the time is well spent. Now, I'm urging you all to please sit down without any further delay while we welcome to the podium, with much gratitude and appreciation, Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Thank you.
Namaskar, good afternoon. मैं हिंदी में बोल सकता हूँ, लेकिन हिंदी में भाषण देने की आदत नहीं है, तो इसलिए मैं अंग्रेजी में बोलूँगा और बाद में अगर प्रश्न हिंदी में आते हैं तो हिंदी में बोल सकता हूँ. distinguished guests, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, members of the Congress, and friends. Um, what I want to talk about today is something that's on all our minds, which is what is happening to liberal democracy in this country? And is it really that necessary for Indian development? I will argue it is, and we absolutely must strengthen it. Now, the reason I thought this would be an interesting topic of discussion is there is a feeling among some quarters in India today that democracy holds back Indian growth. And India needs strong, even authoritarian leadership with few checks and balances on it to grow. And we seem to be drifting in this direction. I believe this argument is totally wrong. It is based on an outdated model of development that emphasizes goods and capital, not people and ideas. I argue that recent underperformance of our country in terms of economic growth, and it has been happening for some time, certainly seems to indicate the path we're going on needs rethinking. I will make the argument that, in fact, our future lies in strengthening our liberal democracy and its institutions, not weakening them. And this is, in fact, essential for our growth. Now, there are, of course, many other reasons why we must confront and defeat majoritarian authoritarianism. For one, any attempt to make second-class citizens of a large minority will divide the country and create internal resentment. In this age of geopolitical turmoil, it will also weaken us and make us vulnerable to foreign meddling. We only have to look south to Sri Lanka to see the consequences when a country's politicians try to deflect from their inability to create jobs by attacking a minority. It doesn't lead anywhere good. And of course, there's a moral reason to have a just, liberal, democratic society. It's what enables each and every one of our citizens to flourish socially and politically. Now, I must emphasize before I get into the meat of my talk that liberalism is not anti-religion. The essence of every major religion is to seek out that which is good in everyone. In many ways, that is also the essence of liberal democracy. Now, with that as preamble, let me talk about the economic rationale for why we need a liberal, argumentative democracy. Start first with where we are. India is rebounding today. Though the consequences of war in Ukraine, the inflation, the rising interest rates around the world are all casting a shadow. Now, any growth that we have should be celebrated, but we cannot ignore the fact that the rebound that we're having is from disastrous numbers posted in the last 2 fiscal years. India's poorest citizens, and especially their children, continue to suffer. And they've suffered during the pandemic, they continue to suffer during a K-shaped recovery that we're having. The scarring of India's lower middle class households and MSMEs will mean that domestic demand will remain subdued after an initial rebound. So we need to figure out how to get growth up. Now, I want to emphasize that India's slow growth is not all the fault of the pandemic. Our underperformance predates the pandemic. Indeed, for about a decade, probably since the onset of the global financial crisis, we haven't been doing as well as we could. The key measure of this underperformance is our inability to create the good jobs that our youth need. Think, for example, of the protests that were triggered by the government's recently announced Agnipath scheme. This is suggestive of how hungry our youth are for jobs. Just a while ago, you saw 12.5 million applicants for 35,000 railway jobs. Now, it's particularly worrisome that India has a scarcity of jobs when so many of our women are not working outside the house. India's female labor force participation is amongst the lowest in the G20 at 20.3% in 2019. In fact, we had only one country which was keeping pace with us, which was Saudi Arabia. And now Saudi Arabia's female labor force participation is 33%. So we are alone. Think how much richer India would be as a country and how much less frustrated our youth would be if there were good jobs for all. So I want to ask the question, where has India gone wrong? But before I try and answer it, let me emphasize that there is much to praise about India's economic record. In the 2 decades after the 1991 reforms initiated by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh, India had 7% growth for 20 years. That's something very few large countries have achieved. And even in the last decade of relatively slow growth, India has had notable successes. Remember, the Aadhaar scheme was conceived of by Nandan Nilekani, and he added to it the Aadhaar stack, which has had multiple applications. Now, this was an early innovation of the UPA government, and it's paying off today. Think about the universal payment interface that many of you have used, or UPI. We have over 4 billion transactions a month now on UPI. We started UPI in 2016 when I was at the RBI. The equivalent Fed now will start at the Federal Reserve only in 2023. UPI is now studied across the world by central banks intending to implement fast retail payments. The point I want to make is not so much that this is the one thing we've done. There's so many things we've done. But when India puts its mind to it, it is second to none. The examples of successes abound, such as our farmers, ISRO, a fantastic organization which has put a satellite around Mars, our various unicorns, and our Thomas Cup badminton team. But we can't indulge only in chest thumping. If we don't assess our failings critically, we will increase the chances of continuing to underperform. So in that spirit of constructive criticism, let me ask, if Indians and India have so much potential, why are we faltering today? Why aren't we creating those jobs that we desperately need? So let's start by asking what worked for us in those 2 decades after liberalization when we grew so wonderfully. I would say at least 3 things. First, we enabled our people with capabilities and empowered them to seek out better futures. We trusted our people. Second, we freed up their access to opportunities. And third, we governed with a dynamic and sensitive touch, with an openness to criticism and a willingness to learn and correct course. Think, for example, about the things that went right in the decade of the 1990s and the 2000s. What few people realize is that we simply did not just tear down the license permit Raj in those years. Between 1990 and 2010, we nearly doubled the years of schooling in our population, from 3.6 years on average to 6.6 years. And since then, we've made some progress, more so amongst men than amongst women. Of course, the steady liberalization of tariffs and regulations did make it easier for businesses to grow, and it allowed our better educated workers to get good jobs. Infrastructure investment helped. Prime Minister Vajpayee's Golden Quadrilateral Highway building program opened up India. And further, the UPA's Gram Sadak Yojana and many such yojanas, including in Chhattisgarh, opened and connected India. And as many of you know, once you have a paved road connecting a village to the rest of India, it does wonders for the village economy. Overnight, you see dairy and poultry farming taking off because milk, eggs, and chicken can be transported to markets. Shops start stocking the latest goods. You see phones coming about, you see SIM cards. You essentially see commerce taking over the village. Development occurs before your eyes as people take charge. Our citizens' control over government was further strengthened by the implementation of Panchayati Raj and the UPA's Right to Information Act. And importantly, government tried to reduce the extent to which the economy was controlled from on top. Instead, it tried to energize people from the bottom. We moved to letting the energy of the people and competition between businesses decide rather than deciding from on top which industries and industrialists were to be favored. Now, this led to 7% growth over 2 decades. But this is the past. What are we doing now? So I think it's important to understand what the current government is trying to do, at least as far as its vision on growth goes. And I would argue its vision centers around the term Atmanirbhar, or self-reliance. Now, to the extent it emphasizes better connectivity, better logistics, better roads, and devotes more resources to it, in some ways this seems a continuation of the past reform decades. And that is good. But in many ways, when you look at what Atmanirbhar is trying to achieve, it takes us back to an earlier and failed past, where we focused on physical capital, not human capital, on protection and subsidies, not on liberalization, on choosing favorites to win, not letting the most capable succeed. It also means that we have a misplaced sense of priorities. What do I mean by that? Think about what we're not spending money on today. There is a tragedy overtaking our school children, especially the poorer ones. Many, not having been to school for 2 years, are dropping out of school. Their human capital, which is their and our most important asset in coming years, is something that we're neglecting. We're failing them by not devoting enough resources to remedial education. Now, perhaps the central government thinks state governments will take care of children. Certainly, education is also a state subject. Indeed, the state I work with, Tamil Nadu, has come up with an innovative scheme, Ilam Thedi Kalvi, to hire 1.75 lakh local workers to offer children remedial learning and draw them back to school. In Tamil Nadu, which has one of the better education systems in the country, workers discovered that over 5 lakh children had dropped out, and these are now being coaxed back. Now, if Tamil Nadu has this problem, think how much worse the problem is across the country. Why aren't we doing more to focus on our children? Why aren't we spending more on our children? And given that states are strapped for finance, the center should be providing more resources to this. So the question we have to ask is, what is the center devoting its money to? One of the big items on the center's agenda in terms of funding is called production-linked incentives, which are subsidies to big manufacturing industry. So let's look at the PLI scheme and ask, what exactly does it do? And why do I say it is a reversion to the past rather than forward thinking? Now, giving credit to the government is very much worried about jobs. And that's why it's trying to energize manufacturing in the country. The scheme it has in mind is PLI. Now, clearly, if you think about what PLI does, is it basically argues our industry is uncompetitive. Our manufacturing cannot compete with the world. And on the Ministry of Electronics website, it says we can't compete because of lack of adequate infrastructure, because we have inadequate availability of power, limited design capabilities, not enough focus on R&D by industry, and inadequacies in worker skills. There are all these problems. Therefore, what do? How do we get manufacturing? We offer tariff protection and subsidies. We raise the tariffs on manufactured goods so that our domestic manufacturers have protection, and offer them subsidies so that we can get more manufacturers to come to India and produce. So, for example, take cell phones. In 2017, the tariffs on cell phone imports were raised from 10% to 20%. That gave manufacturers a 20% margin over the world. In addition, in 2020, the PLI scheme was implemented, which gives 6% of the cell phone's invoice price as a subsidy to the manufacturer. And remember, the value added in a cell phone is about 20 to 25% of the cell phone. So you're adding essentially a 6% margin to producers who are actually producing 20 to 25% of that value. In other words, the profit margin they get is about quarter to one-third of the value added. Given all this, in addition, states are offering power subsidies, land subsidies, capital expenditure subsidies to get manufacturers coming in. So cell phone manufacturers have a great deal, which is why a number of them are willing to set up in India. The question you have to ask for yourself is, how sustainable is this? And who is paying for all this? Clearly, because of tariffs, consumers in India pay more than the international market price for cell phones. That, of course, becomes a direct profit to the manufacturers. I checked the price of a popular cell phone, which is available for both in the US and India. It's priced at 43% more in India than it's priced in the US. That's the margin the manufacturer gets for producing it in India. Tells me the domestic citizen is paying a lot for the privilege of having cell phones manufactured in India. In addition, of course, the taxpayer is paying 6% in production subsidy for every cell phone produced in India, and the state taxpayer pays for state subsidies. So no wonder foreign manufacturers are willing to flock in. And of course, this may be worth it if a cell phone industry emerges in India which matches world costs. The key issue then for whether the PLI scheme succeeds or not is whether manufacturers become more efficient over time so India can remove the protection and subsidies. What does history tell us about this? Well, it tells us we tried something like this before. It was called the license permit Raj, and it failed. Why did it fail? Because in the license permit Raj, there was no impetus for our industry to get efficient because protection never ended. Given that protection never ended, they said, we'll always get subsidies. Why become more efficient? Now, in PLI, there is an ostensible end date when the subsidies end. And hopefully, at that time, the tariff protection that they have will also end. These are hopes. But the real question you should ask is, will they end? In the meantime, government has done little to remedy the deficiencies that render India uncompetitive, for example, increasing the skill base of the workers. So producers will not be competitive when PLI ends. Already firms are lobbying for PLI schemes to be extended to compensate for the pandemic period. And remember, in a few years, there'll be a lot of Indian workers at risk when the subsidy scheme ends, so the political temptation to end them will be considerable. That's one reason why I think the jury is still out on the PLI scheme. Will it make India a manufacturing giant, or will it take us back to the license permit Raj? It's quite possible it's the latter. The other problem, however, with schemes like the PLI schemes is in an attempt to get Indian manufacturing in certain areas, they increase costs to other areas also. So, for example, there's a PLI scheme currently being contemplated for chip manufacturing in India. $10 billion of subsidies for getting chip manufacturing into India. Now, the problem, of course, is as the PLI scheme is implemented, the cost of chips to other Indian manufacturers will go up. And those manufacturers now become less competitive. Think of car manufacturing, lots of chips go into cars. If they have to pay 20, 30, 40% more for chips, the cars that are produced in India become uncompetitive. Ultimately, the entire economy becomes high cost and inefficient if you spread these costs through the economy. This was what we discovered during the license permit Raj. We're trying that experiment again. Last point, I said one of the things that our reform movement did was it created competition. It was no longer who knew that determined how well you did, but what you produced, how efficiently you produced. With production linked subsidies, again, the process about which industries get PLI is non transparent and completely discretionary, leading to the possibility that taxpayer money goes to subsidize well connected industrialists rather than sectors where India may have a natural advantage. So, the broader point is that we are trying an experiment which failed with some minor modifications, which may be enough to make it work. But really, one should worry about the larger aim. Should India try and become a manufacturing powerhouse, given how much protectionism there is today on manufacturing export led growth? Put differently, across the West, across the world, you're seeing increasing protectionism because countries are simply unwilling to accept another China storming its way into their domestic markets. If India is to grow, it has to become another China because that's the size of its workforce. And the West is not open to another China coming into their markets. So even if PLI is effective, we become a manufacturing giant, where are our markets going to be given the kind of protectionism that is emerging, given that China already is there? So what should we do? How do we grow, given that growth is essential? I would say, let's go back to what worked and push it in new directions. What worked? Put people first. Help our people improve capabilities and empower them to seek out better futures. That's number one. Number two, increase their access to opportunities. Number three, govern with a dynamic and sensitive touch. Now, where does all this take us? I would argue that instead of manufacturing-led growth, why not think of a new Indian way? Why not think of service-led growth? If India plays its cards right, it doesn't need to emulate China. It doesn't need to tread along the same path, which is now, as I argued, blocked. It can leapfrog much of the manufacturing stage and go directly to services. Now, let me explain in a little more detail. First, what do I mean by putting people first? When I say putting people first, India has to draw from every person that it has. And in order to draw from every person that it has to give everyone a fair chance, starting from our biggest minority, that is women, and going on to religious minorities like Muslims and disadvantaged castes and tribes. For we know that a discriminatory society is not just immoral, it's weak, as I said earlier. But history also tells us that no minority treated as second-class citizens will stay docile in the face of oppressive behavior by the majority. Equal treatment is not just appeasement. It makes absolute sense. It is the right thing to do. It is also what will take our economy in the right direction. It will allow it to put its best foot forward. Now, so the first element of putting people first is treat people fairly, treat people equally. Second, because of our fiscal resources being strained, we must prioritize. So for example, rather than spending $10 billion on production-linked incentives to create chip factories with some small probability of succeeding. Today, the US is spending $50 billion. We have TSMC in Taiwan spending $30 billion on new factories. So there's a lot of spending on factories going on. Instead of us spending $10 billion in starting from scratch without any assurance of success, why not spend $10 billion on 100 new universities or on 200 old universities upgrading their talents, upgrading their labs, upgrading their facilities, or on 2,000 high schools? Today, chip manufacturing is becoming a commodity business. Where there is value is in chip design. By getting 100 new universities, you get 10,000 new engineers. 10,000 chip engineers can do far more than one chip factory. In other words, when we're thinking about where we prioritize, should we not spend money on people, on their capabilities, on ideas, rather than on subsidizing some industrialists to try making chip factories? As we put people first, as we think about an agenda which increases their human capital, we have to also ask, why is it we haven't done so well on providing public goods to people? Why is it our healthcare systems are deficient? Why is it our schools are not stronger? And I would argue that part of the reason is because people need more power in their hands to be able to affect change. We heard earlier today about one way of empowering people, which is cash transfers to them, giving them the ability to command with the money in their hands better services, because now they can pay for it and they can ask people to provide those services. So cash transfers of the kind that Chhattisgarh is doing are one step in empowering people. A second is to decentralize government. Today, when a teacher doesn't show up in a school in a village, who do you complain to? The teacher is not employed by anybody who has power in the village. The teacher is employed at the state level, and you have to go to the state capital to get redress. If instead there was decentralization, if each panchayat, each municipality had more power over the workers in that panchayat or municipality, would there not be more local control and local responsibility from those functionaries? In other words, can we decentralize funds, functions, and functionaries to the local area? Something the Congress started doing with Panchayati Raj in the late 1980s, but that experiment needs to be continued, because at this point, it is essentially, we have limited the amount of funds, functions, and functionaries that are transferred to the local area. Again, Chhattisgarh is doing some of that, for example, giving local panchayats decision power over sand mining, but more decision powers can be allocated to the local area so that people feel more empowered and can actually take actions on their own futures. Third, if you want to empower people, we also have to put much greater weight on individual rights and freedoms and push courts to enforce them. We have seen in many situations the weaponization of laws, of draconian laws like UAPA and the sedition law. We have seen Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code being used to oppress certain communities and suppress free speech. Now, these laws, if they used well, can help protect the public from criminals and terrorists. But if they're misused, they protect the lazy, the incompetent, and the corrupt in government from the public, or enable the government to hound those it does not like. We've seen both sides of it. And I would argue that going forward, if we want to put people first, we want to give them the ability to protest against ineffective government, we allow them to criticize local government, we need to change these laws, to amend them or repeal many of them so that people do not fear being put in jail just because they protest. We have to improve access to opportunities. There's so many ways we can improve access to opportunity once people have capabilities. Improving access to markets, to self-employment, to finance, etc. On the agricultural side, technology extension, services, investment and marketing support. On the infrastructure side, we can build out much more infrastructure. Again, the Gram Sadak Yojana that the Chhattisgarh government is working on. But one of the biggest problems in in accessing opportunity is the difficulty of doing business. The other day, I was visiting a hill station. And at the lodge, I met the proprietor. And the proprietor said that he had been looking for new lodges to develop. But because he had no idea what the rules governing lodges were, what kind of permissions there were, who he should get permissions from, he decided to buy an existing lodge, even though it was run down, because the alternative of looking for something new, more spacious, was just impossible. It wasn't that the regulation was stifling. He didn't know what the regulations were. He didn't know who to approach to change the regulations. This is something that plagues small business across India. What are the real regulations that we have to adhere to? What are the inspectors we have to meet? What are the inspections we have to pass? And in much of this, as you know, there's also a certain amount of corruption. All these are things we need to work on in order to enable our people to create jobs for themselves, to create the kind of entrepreneurship that is very important going forward. So that's the creating opportunity. Third, we need a learning, transparent government. In the path that we're trying to take, in this new path, which tries to take us out from the tested manufacturing-led growth to something different. We need a government which is willing to experiment, which is willing to try things at a small scale, then roll it out more widely, which is willing to allow data to be gathered both on its successes and failures, which is willing to listen when it goes off track. Now, this requires, therefore, a government that is willing to take criticism. It requires a government that doesn't govern only from the center, from a small coterie which doesn't listen very widely. Instead, decisions should be advised more widely by experts, by discussion in parliament, by debate more broadly. Otherwise, we get very narrow decisions which don't have broad public support. Government should also not suppress unfavorable data. Today, we have no idea what unemployment in India is, because we have absolutely no surveys which collect data on unemployment. We have no idea what the death from COVID was. The number that is officially out there is about 500,000. The number that studies estimate is between 3 and 5 million. It's a big difference between the two. And knowing where the deaths are, how they're occurring, allows government to be responsive. If you suppress the deaths, you have no idea where to act, how to act. The broader point I'm trying to make is data, free speech, criticism, debate, all these are not inessential to government. They're essential to good government because they allow us to find out what's going wrong, allow us to change. Liberal democracy offers governments the best environment to learn and be more effective. This is something that all complex countries have discovered and are taking action on, strengthening their democracy rather than weakening it. And that's the direction we should go. Now, let me end in the last three to 5 minutes. If we do all this, if we put people first, we create opportunities for them, we strengthen government by making it more sensitive and willing to adapt to the realities on the ground, where should we go? How should we create these jobs? Now, we should certainly continue what we're doing. We're building our infrastructure. We're trying to expand manufacturing. We shouldn't do it through subsidies, but following the old path of creating more competition, opening up the economy, trying to encourage more growth in that way. But I also think that we have a new potential path, which is focusing on service-led growth. Let me explain why the environment has changed to favor service exports. By the way, today India exports 400 million in goods. We export 250 million in services. We have a deficit on goods exports. We have a huge surplus on service exports. We have a comparative advantage in services. So the real question is, if we're trying to put the emphasis. Where should we put the emphasis? On manufacturing goods or on services? And I would argue we can do it in services. Let me explain why the environment has changed. During the pandemic, it became easy to provide high value added services at a distance. If a consultant can work from home in Chicago to service clients in Austin, can't she work from Hyderabad to service those clients in Austin? The market for services like consulting, legal and financial advisory, education, and telemedicine are ripe for globalization. And unlike goods, services delivered online cannot be stopped at a physical border. Furthermore, when we talk about protectionism, the biggest suppliers of services in the world are the United States and Europe. And therefore, it is not in their interest to be overly protectionist, to erect barriers to services. In fact, it is in their interest to be more open. Second, India has a key asset in providing services, its liberal democracy. Think, for example, when you provide medical services, one of the biggest elements in medical services is data and data privacy. The patient on the other side doesn't want her data to be just spread around without any notion of privacy. She also doesn't want your government to be looking at her data. Her government doesn't want you to be looking at her data. So if you want to provide medical services across border, one of the things you have to assure the other side is you will have strict controls on the data. You will protect that data. The data will stay within the provider, and it will even be protected from your own government. What countries can give better assurance of this kind of data protection? Typically, transparent, tolerant democracies which are governed by the rule of law. So if, for example, we can convince other countries that our own government cannot see our data without going through the courts, our own firms can be sued in a court if they spread the data around, we have a much better chance of getting into data-intensive services, something that a country like China cannot get into because there are no checks and balances on the Chinese government. The US today will not allow China to provide financial services in the US. In fact, a number of Congress people in the US are saying we should put restrictions on TikTok because it gathers up so much data. When data is the new oil, think about countries that have much greater ability to commit that the data will stay private. Those countries will have an advantage in providing services. Add to that the fact that India is already known for providing services across the world. Our software engineers have done wonders for us here. A final reason for why focusing on services rather than manufacturing is the world is growing green. Services are expanding. Manufacturing cannot expand at that pace because it's impossible for the world to grow its consumption of goods as it did in the past. More of the consumption basket will increasingly consist of services. Why don't we focus more on spreading services across the world? So what does this mean in terms, and this is where I'll end, what does it mean in terms of what we need to do? Well, certainly we need to improve the capabilities of our people, but we also need to, for example, when we're talking about telemedicine, we need Indian degrees to be recognized across the world. We need, therefore, the process by which Indian doctors get qualified in the US to be made easier, that Indian doctors shouldn't have to travel there, that exams be offered across the world so that Indian doctors can qualify. Similarly, in terms of insurance, one of the biggest things in medicine is that national insurance typically pays for medical services. We need the national health system of the United Kingdom to pay for Indian doctors. We need Medicare, Medicaid to pay for Indian doctors. For that, our government has to take it up with those countries and say, we want to do this. And it'll be good for you because we will be providing medical services, taking some of the burden off your overclogged medical services in the National Health Scheme. In the UK, it takes 6 months to get an appointment for this and that. If we could take some of the pressure off that by providing medical services from India, that would be good, but for that we need to negotiate with them. The broader point is, instead of just focusing on manufacturing, if we start moving to services and think, what do our service providers need for us to open up the doors to them across the world? Now, last question, you're going to ask, is this going to provide enough jobs? Yes, it can provide jobs to doctors. Yes, it can provide jobs to our well-educated young people who become consultants or lawyers. What about Aam Janta? Is it going to provide jobs for them? Well, first, typically any high-level job in India creates 5 or 6 more jobs. 5 or 6 more jobs around, because there are people who help that doctor, nurses, assistants, clerks, cooks. There's lots of jobs of that kind created. So that's one. Second, those jobs themselves, as they provide incomes, allow those households to educate their children. And the leap forward for that next generation of children is tremendous. At the RBI, for example, I used to see our class 4 employees, typically the peons, when they used to come to our house, they used to bring their children with them. The children were often bank managers working for Infosys. They were successful way beyond their parents. They had made the jump because their parents could put them in reasonable schools and give them a good education. They went on to college, got good jobs. So the point I'm trying to make is, we need to create jobs of any kind with reasonable incomes, and then use education, use good healthcare to elevate that next generation, so that in 20 years, they leapfrog their parents and we get a far stronger, far richer, far better economy. So let me end by saying we need an Indian growth path that draws on the capability of Indians and builds on India's historic culture of tolerance and respect for all. It's a growth path that builds on India's liberalism, on our ability to debate, to criticize, to essentially argue with one another. Now, I think this will improve the quality of India's governance, but as important, it'll make India trusted by citizens elsewhere in the world. In other words, I'm suggesting that India can become a Vishwaguru, not just based on the basis of ideas of the past, but because it has a new vision of green, inclusive, local-led growth and development, and based primarily on services rather than manufacturing. And it persuades the rest of the world that this works by essentially doing it. This path will not be easy given the current ruling ideology, but I think it can be a manifesto for change, and I'm happy to answer questions from Dr. Tharoor. Now, this is our 75th year of independence. Let me end by saying I believe India's best days are still ahead, but we really have to work to make it so. I think we can, but that work has to start now. Let me start.
Thank you very much, Raghu. That was an amazing tour de force, covering a vast, vast area, far bigger, in fact, than just the topic that was officially announced. But I'm going to start just by touching base on some of the points you made so that we can take it forward from there. And then I'd really like to hear from the audience as well. So those of you who have questions, I think, Alam, you've dropped the idea of the papers, right? I think we'll just ask you to raise your hands. Yeah. Is that right? Okay, but we'll come to that when I've asked Raghu a couple of questions myself. So the first one, Raghu, is really the somewhat intriguing, and I might even say counterintuitive finding that the production-linked incentives, the PLI, actually raise the cost of goods for Indian consumers. So are you essentially advocating then that we do away with PLIs? Because this is one issue that the government has not only got away with, but got away with fairly consensually. The opposition parties have tended by and large to hail this as something that makes more manufacturing in India possible and therefore welcome. No one seems to have cottoned on to this particular argument that it's raising the price for Indian consumers.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think the PLI starts first with the tariff. You're going to increase the tariff on the stuff you're going to produce domestically. That immediately raises the cost. Add to that the fact that beyond that tariff increase, you're also offering subsidies to those people. That's increasing the cost to the taxpayer. Now, the hope is you create those jobs producing cell phones. Now, remember, the cell phone is not produced using all Indian manufactured equipment. In fact, as I said, the value added is 25%. 75% of the cell phone is imported. So our import bill also goes up. Now, the hope is that in addition to selling some of those cell phones domestically, they'll export some of those cell phones. And they're doing that. But think of how much it costs you for them to export. You're giving them a 6% in the first year subsidy on the, let's say they go to the full value added, 25%. You're giving them 6% on that 25%. Which manufacturer would not love a 25% margin on what they're doing? So this is a very, very lucrative scheme for manufacturing. You're paying a lot for those jobs. And you hope and pray that when the scheme ends, those jobs will still stay. Will they stay? That's the, at this point, $200 billion question. Will those jobs actually stay without the subsidies, without the tariffs? If they stay only with the tariffs, you've committed to a high-cost manufacturing throughout. Because those tariffs were implemented, you need to bring them down. The subsidies theoretically will go away. But even then, these guys are starting to lobby. Oh, we can't survive without those subsidies because you haven't done anything. I mean, they have a good argument. You haven't improved the quality of the labor force. You haven't made power more. All those deficiencies they listed, they'll say nothing has changed on that. How can you just take away the subsidies? So the government says if they manufacture here in a big way, the cost will come down. That's a theory. Let's wait and see. I hope it is right. If it's not right, we're back to we've just subsidized the high-cost manufacturing.
That's an interesting thought. And of course, the people here are themselves purchasers of mobile phones, and you just opened their eyes to the realization. But let me take you in a philosophical direction. Is the lowest cost necessarily the only social objective of a democratic government? Is there some argument to be made that yes, the Indian taxpayer or the Indian consumer may need to pay more in order to fulfill the larger desirable social objective of having manufacturing in India and employing more people in that process, even if it means paying more? Because, the other side of the argument, Raghu, we always hear is, my God, even the idols of gods we buy in Indian markets are made in China.
Right.
Why hasn't the government prevented that? Why can't our traditional artisans and sculptors and everybody else be getting this business that now is all going to China? So the question often is that there is a certain value to some things being done in your own country.
Right. I was reading about that. We were complaining about idols being manufactured in Japan in the 1930s. We've just changed the country we complain about. Well, if they manufacture the idols in a reasonable way, that's good. The question is, are there other things that we could do? Do we have to force the manufacturing of idols in India? Or are there things we could do more effectively? And that's the question we should be asking. Put differently, how much does it cost us to get these jobs into India? And are they highly skilled jobs or are they low skilled assembly jobs? If they're low skilled assembly jobs where you're not paying these workers very much, do we need that amount of subsidy to get that in? What is the per worker cost of doing this? Now, you would be amazed when the US applied tariffs to keep steel worker jobs in the US. It was realized the cost per job was $300,000 for keeping those jobs. So tariffs are not innocuous. When you raise them and force the customers to pay more, you're forcing 500 million Indians who buy these cell phones to pay for those 5,000 jobs that are created. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot for the 500 million Indians, but you put 20% per cell phone, add it up, divide it by 5,000 jobs. It's a lot to pay for those 5,000 jobs. So the amazing thing I have discovered is nobody in India, nobody in government has done a study on this, has actually found how much it costs to create these jobs. And of course, we don't know yet whether these jobs will stay once the subsidies are lifted and once the tariffs are lifted. The worry I have, and this is why I say experiment before you roll out. We're rolling it out in a big way.
Yeah.
Now we're doing 10 billion for chip manufacturing. We don't even know what kind of chips we'll get for 10 billion. Now, chip manufacturing is a very capital intensive business.
That's right.
And countries are putting 30, 40, 50 billion at it and still not being satisfied. Intel wants that 50 billion that the US government is putting, even though it has state of the art factories already. Because to make the next leap, it has to do far more. The worry I have in all this is in these kinds of very capital intensive manufacturing, the number of jobs you're going to create is a pittance. Any chip factory is going to take maybe 500 people, 1,000 people. And it's not even clear you become self-sufficient because the critical problem is not the low-quality chips. It's the high-quality chips. If you're doing defense equipment, you need those high-quality chips. You're not going to be able to manufacture those at, even with a 10
I
billion
think we sort of
subsidy.
saw the Chinese moving into that area and said, my gosh, if they can do it, why can't we? Because you remember there was a time in the 70s and 80s when China was practically manufacturing nothing of their own. Everything was imitative, and this was something too complicated to imitate. Now they're actually world leaders. The Taiwanese and the Chinese together have pretty much cornered 80, 90% of the semiconductor chip manufacturing process.
The Chinese are not at the frontier yet. They're
No.
behind. And that's why they want Taiwan. Because with Taiwan, they get to the frontier. But the Chinese have spent 50 to 100 billion
Yeah.
in the last couple of years on trying to get more chip manufacturing. And they're still not at the frontier. So if you want to play this game, the amount that you have to spend,
Is not worth the credit.
10 billion will get you nothing.
Yeah.
But 10 billion will get us 200 high quality universities. Do we want those 200 high quality universities, or do we want, one big factory somewhere?
Fair point. Okay, so then let's just move on from that particular argument to one of the solutions. You gave us a diagnosis and a prescription. One of them was, let's improve our production of and export of services. But again, there is a question of how many jobs can you create in services? And secondly, have you skilled enough people to provide the services that the world now needs? And in both questions, I fear there is a particular challenge.
It is a challenge. It's not going to be easy. But I would say, therefore, let's start today. Let's start investing far more in things like education, in things like healthcare than we are doing. Recognizing that our people are going to be our greatest strength. And therefore, that's why I'm saying, I find the complete neglect of this fact that our children have missed 2 years. And Pratham or Acer basically says 2 years in school that you missed means you're 4 years behind because you've forgotten also in the 2 years that you were there. So our kids, that cohort, that entire cohort, except for the ones in really good schools with access to iPads and computers, the rest actually are failing at this point. And to rescue them, we need a substantial amount of investment in remedial education. And we're not doing that. We're going to push them up. They'll keep getting promoted, but they won't understand anything in class. We'll get more dropouts. Tamil Nadu had 500,000 kids dropping out. They had to be coaxed back into class. I don't know if we're doing surveys like that elsewhere in the country, but if we're not, we risk a lost generation. And so I would argue, start first with saving our existing kids, then work on increasing their opportunity to do far better. They should have access to many more high quality colleges, many more high quality schools with the right labs, with the right supports. And thereby, we can actually increase the quality of our human capital significantly. And that's going to be where we create the jobs. That's going. I mean, think about a university. I work with a university in the south today,
Which one?
Kriya. It's a new university. University employs maybe 120 faculty. It employs another 300, 400 support staff, right? And with that, you're training kids to get a bachelor's degree. Those kids will go out and get a whole set of new jobs because they're now trained up to world standards. Some of them will go for higher education, but many of them can become your consultants, these things, your supports to investment banks, and so on. Those kids will create another 5, 6 jobs apiece. So my sense is, manufacturing provides far less when you think about it. That little unskilled assembly is something that, yes, provides jobs, but doesn't provide growth. And the kind of growth providing manufacturing that one can have is very limited.
Well, the other challenge I've noticed is that technology also overtakes some of our success stories. Now, you remember the time when medical transcription was a big sunrise industry, and we cornered 90% of the world market on that. Here you had American doctors dictating their notes at the end of the day into a computer, and it was zinged over to India while the American was asleep, and some fairly qualified Indian chap transcribed the whole thing and sent it back. And when the American woke up in the morning, his notes were there, complete and accurately typed. Much cheaper and more effective than hiring a secretary. And then comes voice recognition software, and suddenly the American doesn't need the guy in India. He can just dictate into his computer and it understands his accent and reads, types out for him automatically. Now, suddenly a business where India thought they were thriving, where we had mushrooming companies being established and people investing in homes and cars expecting to have this job for the next 25 years, suddenly they're all unemployed and the companies are out of business. Now, that's the kind of challenge for which I don't know whether we have enough answers in India, but how would you tackle that kind of phenomenon if you were making policy?
Every country has that problem. And the thing is obviously to keep adapting, right? To keep adapting to what the new needs are. And that means constant learning. So Scandinavia, these are countries that are small, that are buffeted by trade shocks every few years. And what they do is they try and keep their workers constantly learning. So you're here today. What is it that you need to learn? What is it that you need to learn to keep your skills up? What are the forces that are coming to hit you? That is called an active labor market. Now, we're very far from that. But the question is, if we want to succeed in this world which is dynamic, where things are changing all the time, we have to be able to impart new skills all the time, even when those skills aren't currently needed. You have to remember your job will become obsolete in 5 years, given the pace of change. So take radiologists, right?
They used to be reading MRIs from America, and now they're no longer needed, right?
Well, but even in the US, right, MRIs now can be read by machine because AI is increasingly developing capabilities. That said, what the doctor there does is provide the last view. What is happening still is nobody trusts the machine to get it right. So the machine provides the input to the doctor, who at the end determines whether this is right or not. There is still a last channel. But it does mean that, increasingly there will be less space for doctors doing that particular activity, because the machine does most of the analysis and the doctor finally decides whether it's right or not, which means we have to retrain in something else. Now, there's no dearth of demand for medical services in the US, right? Try getting a doctor, it takes you, 3 months to get a doctor's appointment. So the demand is very high. And that's why I'm saying making it easier to provide those services, whether at a distance or by machine, there's still plenty of demand for that kind of thing.
Well, there's also some demand for one very old-fashioned thing we're doing reasonably well at even today, and that's medical tourism. We do operations of high quality, cheaper, and we look after patients better than most Western hospitals can do. And we are actually attracting people to come just to have their hips replaced or their knees replaced or even bypasses done in India for a fraction of what it would cost them and with swifter appointments than they would get on the West.
Absolutely, which is why I'm saying, why don't we negotiate with the US and with the UK? Not just about the, oh, we'll keep, we want to protect our culture and this and that. But talk about them paying for patients who come to India to get their hip replacement. Talk about national insurance paying for these kinds of services. That, to my mind, will be an advance. We will get a lot more demand for our hospitals, and of course, it'll be win-win. But more, I mean, when we think about services, I'm not talking just about the kind of services that are high value-added services. Tourism is a service which is very, very important. We can do far more of that. But again, tourism requires us to have a liberal image. Not that we're a harsh, oppressive government, but we are a liberal government which loves everybody from across the world. We invite everybody.
And we look after them well when they come.
And we look after them well. This is our historical reputation. It would be a shame to lose it. I think it's very important to convey that kind of image. Another service is construction. Construction is another service. And we need a lot of construction. We are seeing some attempt to do what is necessary, but there's far more that can be done. Homes for the poor, various Awas Yojanas. There is various roads, ports, airports.
But that's Indians doing things in India for other Indians.
That is also part of the services. What I'm saying is there's so much we can do with services. And let's focus on manufacturing because that's the way to go, and let's pay what it takes to get it done. I think we need to at least test that hypothesis.
Well, sir, that's been a profound insight I think we've all gained from this excellent lecture and conversation. I've got 3 members of the audience who have asked for the floor with questions. So let me go to them one by one. When I call out your name, if you don't mind standing up so they can hand you a mic and you can read out your question. First is Uwais Ali Khan. I think right there. Who has a mic, Alam?
Mic will come to you. Can we get the mic there, please?
And just for all the other colleagues, Uwais, can you tell us which chapter you've come from of AIPC and what you do, and then ask your question. You have to press some button, I think, to make it work.
Try it now.
Alam, this should have been taken care of earlier.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rajan, Dr. Tharoor. First of all, warm welcome to the National Conclave of All India Professionals Congress. I am Uwais Ali Khan, Chartered Accountant by profession, and also the Secretary of Uttar Pradesh West Professionals Congress, and also heading the Finance Professionals Vertical of All India Professionals Congress. Sir, we are discussing the challenges and problems in Indian economy these days almost at every level. My question from you is, if you were the finance minister of the country at present, which we wish soon you became, what key steps you would have taken to reclaim our lost economic glory? Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Raghu, if you don't mind, shall we take all 3 questions? Sure. Because the clock has ticked past 1:30. Sure. Rukshmani Kumari. Right in the front row here, can you pass the mic? And third will be Venkatram Reddy, if he can also stand up and show where he is. There he is. So the mic has to go back there afterwards.
Welcome, sir. I'm Rukshmani Kumari, and I head the All India Professionals Congress for Rajasthan. I have a question for you, sir. I wanted to tell you about me. I run an NGO called Star Foundation, and I also run hotel. So my question is, if China succeeds without liberal democracy, and India has fallen behind despite having liberal democracy, then how can you argue that liberal democracy is essential to successful economic growth?
Excellent. We get some philosophical questions in there. And the last one, Mr. Venkatram Reddy, right at the back. If somebody could take the mic to him, please.
He's got it.
I'm here.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm from AIPC Telangana. I have a question, sir. We are talking about manufacturing, less manufacturing and more of services. But are we ignoring the big market we have here in India itself? Today, protectionism is a big thing everywhere. And what if it's not that we have a demand, and what if the supply would not come to us? Not having a strong manufacturing base, would it impact us in the long term in that sense? Thank you.
So those three questions, perhaps, Raghu, before we break for lunch.
Yeah. So start first with, do you need a manufacturing base? I'm not saying do away with it. I'm saying don't mollycoddle it. Going back to the infant industry, we need to protect it. We need to, these were the old arguments that were made. I would say by all means, we should have manufacturing. Whatever we can do, which is sensible, makes sense, we should do it. But let's not overly subsidize it. Let's figure out what we need to spend on. And that leads to the question, shouldn't we be spending more on education, on healthcare, so that we create more human capital in the country? And that can then either do more manufacturing, but I would argue that can also go into services. Certainly the world needs more services, but India also needs more services. So I'm not saying do away with manufacturing, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is, if you want to put your spending, which basket do you put your spending in? Do you subsidize the manufacturers and do you sort of protect them? Or do you try and encourage more human capital building in the country? And I would say the latter rather than the former, which goes back to the first question, which was what, what kind of policies would you follow? I certainly think that one of the most important issues for us today is really how do we encourage more human capital building in the country, right? Which is how we push more resources to education and healthcare. And that's something we need to think about. And I'm not just saying government spending. How do we get more private sector spending in those areas? For example, if we're talking about healthcare, how do we get the private sector to provide more high quality healthcare? One of the problems often is the private sector provides healthcare, but it's not particularly high quality. So those are the things we need to think about. How do we get more human capital building in the country? On the issue of what else would you do, one of the things we need to really think about is the business environment. How do we make it easier for a small guy to start up in the country and to have a strong business? We just heard about a private entrepreneur. We need so many more of those. Now, everybody is looking for the government to create jobs, but the government can create only a small number of jobs. The reality is much of the jobs have to be created outside the government. And big business is not creating too many jobs. It has to be created by small enterprises growing big. How do we create the environment which allows for that? And that's why I'm saying we need to move away from the top down. These are the industrialists I'm going to favor. These are the ones I'm going to help. To how do I create the environment, the business environment that allows a lot more people to flourish? How do I give them certainty that they will not be troubled by a tax inspector? They will not be troubled by somebody who asks to inspect their boilers? How do I tell them which rules they have to obey? How do I make it easier for them to get finance? Those are the things. We need to think about how to encourage small business in this country much more than we're doing today. So that is another thing I would focus on. On the, we could go on, but I need to answer the last question. Your question was, why do you think liberal democracy? I would argue we've had an imperfect liberal democracy. And I would say the clear example of it not working is how little we spent on education in the first so many years. If you look at the first 3 decades of India, our education attainments were miserable. We didn't improve the quality of the years of schooling significantly. If you think about the one big difference between China and India, when they started liberalizing, China started liberalizing in early 80s, India in the late 80s. The big difference was China had people with much greater schooling than India had. For India, it was liberalization which helped create the jobs that required more schooling. People looked for more schooling, and that happened. But in China, they had already been educated by the communist system to much higher levels of education. There was a huge difference. And so I would argue we had a democracy, but it wasn't working in the broader interests of people. Over time, it has done more of that, but we need to ensure that keeps going by strengthening our democracy, by making sure it works for the people rather than it works for a narrow elite. And that's the work we need to do.
But even if one agrees with that point, China's success is still a repudiation of the democratic evangelists, isn't it? Because they really don't have a democracy at all in any meaningful sense of the term. And yet they have grown and outstripped every other democracy.
So I would argue the following, and you can hold me to this. I think we've seen peak China. That China has benefited tremendously from what they did right on encouraging manufacturing. But now they have to make the next step, which is a service-oriented economy. And that's where I think some of the advantages of democracies will come in. The fact that there are checks and balances, the fact that the government cannot determine everything. One of the problems with China today, of course, is that President Xi has some very set views on the direction China has to take. And those views, even the zero COVID policy, but before that, the policy against the private sector and the attack on the private sector.
On the bigwigs in the private sector.
Bigwigs in the private sector was popular, but the broader, we should determine what is good, what is not, has the old central planning view. And my sense is those are things which sort of hit against what made China successful so far. And therefore, I would say unless China sort of rediscovers a new path, the old path has reached its limits. And as a result, growing further in this direction may be really difficult. Now, people have called time on China many times and been wrong. But I would argue that China has reached the limits of that manufacturing-led growth. Even for political reasons, the West is not willing to accept anymore.
That's right. And in any case, you don't have a track record of being proved wrong. You've actually been pretty right in most of what you said. Colleagues, sorry, we are going to extend this slightly. Alam is saying that 4 colleagues from 4 different states have again asked for the floor with questions. I think I don't want to deprive ourselves of Raghu's wisdom. So we'll just extend it by a few more minutes, and I'll take your 4 questions and ask Raghu to give us quick answers. So the first one is Kranti Naidu from AIPC Andhra. Where are you? I'll mention everyone, so you can please just stand up and show yourselves to the mic. Second one is Pradeep Sharma, Special Advisor to CM Chhattisgarh. Where are you, sir? There you are. You already got the mic in your hand? Okay, then let him ask it first. Oh, you've got your mic too? All right, go on, Kranti Naidu. I asked you first. Okay.
So thanks for giving this opportunity. I am Kranti Naidu from AIPC Andhra. Our question is regarding Nyay scheme. How much it is reliable and useful we want to know, sir. Because in our AP also, based on this only, they had started AP Navratnalu one scheme, it is going on, sir. Based on that, they are giving money directly to the people on different schemes like education, Amavadi scheme like that. Some schemes are there which they are giving directly to the people, and they are not concentrating on other schemes like corporation funds, etc., which they are also useful for the people to become self-reliant, like they can start their own business like that. But they are not concentrating on other schemes, and they are directly giving, the government is directly giving money to the people. How much it is reliable and how it increases the economy of the state. Now we are debt-driven, and our Andhra Pradesh state is the most debt-driven state in the country now. How Nyay scheme can overcome this one, and how it is connected? Is any connection between like that?
Yeah, adding to the debts of the state. I get you. Pradeep Sharma, Chhattisgarh.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. It's a very enlightening lecture. My question is that India contributes almost around 8% of minerals in the whole world, whereas we have only 2.5% of contribution of GDP of these minerals in the whole budget of India. So don't you think that still we have lots of scope for mineral-based production systems in this country? One. Second, in the service industries, don't you think that only a huge portion of elite Indian would be benefited rather than the general people?
Thank you, Pradeep. Manish Khanduri, AIPC Uttarakhand. Can you give him the mic for the side?
Behind you.
Hello. Yes. Thank you. As a very quick aside, my name is Manish Khanduri and I'm from Uttarakhand. As a very quick aside, I want to say that I never had the privilege of hearing you speak when I went to the business school that was to the south of Booth. But I can now say that although I never heard you with Dr. Deepak Jain at Kellogg, I have had the privilege of hearing you with Dr. Shashi Tharoor in Raipur, Chhattisgarh. My question to you is, you've already spoken on the subject. Now, it's a very wide-ranging lecture, and you've spoken about social democracy, and you've spoken about service-oriented economy. What is this role you think of possibly of crypto as a technology in driving all of this that you've mentioned? Now, I want to be very careful. I'm not speaking of it as an investment opportunity, nor am I asking you which is the best one, obviously. But essentially, the role of crypto in everything that you've said for a country like India.
And finally, and this is the last question before lunch, if any of you are burning to ask, save it for a later session. Bhushan Bendre Kalyan. Where are you? Oh, there you are.
Can we get the sound? Please have a look.
Hello. 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 Yes. Hello, Dr. Raghuram Rajanji, Dr. Shashi Tharoorji. I am Advocate Bhushan Bendre, a lawyer from Kalyan and Secretary of Kalyan AIPC. Sir, I have two questions, one for Dr. Raghuram Rajanji and one for Dr. Shashi Tharoorji. I'll start with Dr. Shashi Tharoorji. Sir, Dr. Raghuram Rajanji gave a mention in his speech about that data is the new oil. We have seen that data have been harnessed so rigorously that even we go and ask for a burger in McDonald's, they first ask about our number and then only they generate the bill. So data privacy is a serious concern. I just want a suggestion from you. I may be wrong, sir. You are very senior and veteran parliamentarian. So can we bring a data protection bill through a private member's bill in the parliament? I know that numerically we are very less in both the houses of the parliament, but still we can create an impact. Even if the bill falls down in the parliament, we can create an impact that, see, we have an intention of protecting the data of this country, but this ruling government doesn't have that kind of intention. This answer I want from you, Dr. Shashi Tharoorji. I'll be very glad to hear it from you. And the second one, to Dr. Raghuram Rajanji, that I have seen that few generations before, my father was a government employee working for a national bank. My grandfather was working for Indian Railways. The recent data have come, which were answered in the parliament by Dr. Jitendra, that the government employments opportunities which were created in the country were only 7 lakh till date 2021-22. And the applications which had come were over 22 crores for government, central government jobs. So can we create something for that? The trend is very dangerous, that since 2014, the government employee have been seriously collapsing like anything. Thank you, Dr. Shashi Tharoorji, for giving a professional like me an opportunity to be the part of AIPC. I had earlier been very reluctant in the politics, but now I have become very interested in politics. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for that kind word. I must say that this is exactly why we created AIPC, to give professionals like you an outlet and a connection to the political world. I'll quickly answer the question you asked me directly, and I might add that this figure of 7 lakh jobs and 22 crore applications is one that I had come across, was planning to ask you, so I'm glad that, that Mr. Bendre did. Very simply, I myself have introduced a personal data protection private members bill, first in 2017 and reintroduced it with a new Lok Sabha in 2019. But needless to say, private members bills simply don't take off. That's part of the challenge we have in our politics. The government's data protection bill had a couple of very serious flaws, which we pointed out. But rather than bringing that bill to my committee, the IT committee, which is of course chaired by a congressman, the government preferred to create a select committee chaired by a BJP member, and they were able to outvote us when we opposed that proposal, because obviously we knew it was designed only to take the bill away from an opposition-led committee. That's what our politics has become now. But anyway, to cut a long story short, after 1 year or 2 years, delayed also by COVID, they finally came up with an extensive report, and all the Congress members in that select committee dissented. So we don't have a particularly happy outcome. Since then, that select committee's version of the bill has been sitting with the government for almost a year, and they've done nothing about it. When I spoke to the minister unofficially, so I ask you to treat this as an unofficial statement, his reply was that there were some problems because it would be a powerful disincentive for IT companies to operate in India if the bill as drafted by the committee were to go ahead. So the government was still mulling over how to change the draft. So I think we have a genuine problem, but the bigger problem, as I see as a parliamentarian, is the government is passing other bills day after day, which actually need the underpinning of a data protection bill to keep our consumers safe. For example, the DNA bill. DNA is also data. And if the government can collect and store your DNA every time that you're caught for a speeding offense or anything, what are the laws under which that is going to be preserved? Where are the data protection guarantees? There are no satisfactory answers. I've raised this very question in Parliament. So we need the data protection bill to underpin a whole lot of other legislation that has come and may come in future. But as you say, in the meantime, both the government and the private sector are busy connecting data left, right, and center. They are sort of digging their oil wells on the backs of our information. And some of the basic principles of data protection, that data should belong to he or she who generates it, that once the government has a right to take it for a particular purpose and that purpose is served, thereafter the data should be destroyed or returned to the person who owns it, that if there is a dispute, there should be an independent data protection authority. The government has only proposed one, where the data protection authority is not independent but is made up of government officials. All of these questions, these basic core principles, are so far being bypassed by the government. So whenever the bill comes, there is another worry, which is that we will point all this out in debates on the floor of the House. But because of their brute majority, they'll probably pass a bad bill, and the country will have to live with the consequences. These are the challenges I see in this particular issue. Sorry to give you a dispiriting answer, but I'll get that out of the way and then turn back to Raghu for the 4 economic questions.
So just on those questions, one, is Nyaya a good scheme? Well, no scheme can be divorced from the circumstances in which it is implemented. Generally giving people cash transfers so that they can decide what they want to do with it is a form of empowerment, but also relies on them making good decisions, which typically we found actually happens. So studies generally suggest that people can make those decisions. So I think in general it's a good thing, but then you're asking the question, what if it comes at the expense of other investments the government has to make? And clearly, the government cannot sort of put everything in this basket and not make investments in roads, in ports, and all the other kind of necessary work the government has to do. So this has to be seen as part of the function of the government. And I would say, by and large, the more targeted it is, the more it's going to help particular segments. And therefore, it can be more generous to those segments. Rather than having a thin sort of subsidy to everybody, have it more focused on the truly needy, but sufficient to lift them up in a proper way. I think that, to my mind, would make it more effective. On the notion that minerals, of course, the problem, of course, with many minerals is they are found in tribal areas. And then the question of tribal protection becomes a big issue. What safeguards do we have that their concerns, their livelihoods, their hunting grounds, all those are preserved in a way? What kind of compromise can be reached with them? And I think you understand the issues certainly there. But of course, especially some of the high value minerals in the country, we certainly should think of ways of exploiting them without impairing the livelihoods of others. I think the point about services being elite is an important one. It doesn't have to be so. That there are lots of services which I think, first, tourism, for example, can go right down to every, to the unskilled level. and employ very many people. So we can do far more of those. Yes, there are some elite services, but manufacturing is also becoming elite. Today, much of the when you talk to a Bajaj, there's not a whole lot of workers employed there. Typically, they're people keeping the machines running. That's a highly skilled job. So manufacturing has also become elite, but I would say services has the ability to spread across much more. Because in fact, if we have the ability to lift people up through reasonable schooling and through a decent university, we can immediately make them capable of getting high quality jobs across the world, especially with working at a distance. However, there is work to be done. A lot of our graduates don't have strong skills because the colleges aren't teaching them adequately. So we need to upgrade the quality of our colleges, our universities, but even before that, upgrade the quality of our schools so that children come out of school waiting to learn more rather than being tired of learning. So lots of work to be done, absolutely, but it doesn't have to be elite. It can be much more broad-based. Cryptocurrencies, I suspect the question is from the perspective of, can cryptos work in improving things like, data, registries for property and so on? Can crypto be used for, elections? Look, I mean, at the heart of it is the notion that here's a decentralized ledger, doesn't need a central authority, can be operated without that central authority. So there are lots of things that can be applied for. I agree with that notion, but I think before we get to this being the solution to everything, there are in many situations more direct solutions at present. Longer run, perhaps this can reduce costs, but at this point, and I'm saying it's not cryptocurrency, but the underlying technology.
Blockchain.
Blockchain,
It's blockchain you're
decentralized ledger.
But I mean, the difficulty will be that, for example, something like land records,
Yeah.
government needs to have some authority to control and be aware of it, whereas blockchain by definition is beyond the government's control.
Exactly. So in other words, a permission system rather than a permissionless system may work, with the permission system being sort of governed by the government. You have a centralized ledger. It's not a decentralized ledger. But that would work as well. In fact, that's maybe the only solution in that case. Last question, government employment. India actually, if you look at the number of government employees relative to the size of the population or to the size of the GDP, is relatively small. But I would argue that what we need is to figure out what kind of government jobs we really need more of. Typically, they're more at the local level rather than the central or the state level. We need far more local officials to carry out the various programs the government is engaged in. And there, we need to also make sure that those officials actually do the work that is required. So that's where I'm talking about decentralization. Decentralization, local government jobs would actually, in my view, be something that could improve the governance in this country. So I agree with the point, we probably need more government jobs, but I wouldn't treat them as government jobs just because we need jobs, but jobs because we need government to do more. And therefore, we need to put them in the right places. We can't all, we can't have significantly more jobs in Delhi. It has to be jobs in the local municipality, in the taluka. That's where we need the jobs.
It's a real challenge, and the other complications we haven't had the time to address. Some of the applicants, in fact, the majority of the applicants are overqualified for the jobs they require. So you'll have, for example, a police constable job requiring a 10th grade pass, and you have PhDs applying for it because they can't get any jobs. And the skill mismatch, or even at least qualification mismatch, has become a serious problem. The other problem is that we have an astonishing tail to teeth ratio in our government. Unlike other governments, we have jobs for chaprasis, for peons to carry files from one desk to another and so on, which actually don't require very high qualifications, but those are the jobs which by and large, our government is trying to cut down upon and dispense with, but there's natural resistance because too many people are unable to do anything else. So, I mean, these are all aspects of that. It's a very problematic issue on which it'd be wonderful if you or one of your doctoral students could spend some time, because it is, and you know, sarkari naukri has been a dream of every Indian from a poor family.
Well, absolutely. And one of the tragedies in India is precisely these students sitting for exam after exam after exam until they superannuate from being able to give another exam for in another government exam. So at age 32, they've given all the exams they can, but now cannot take any more exam. And what do they do at that point? At that point, they start looking for a job in the private sector. I mean, we really need to create more jobs. Absolutely.
Well said. I want to just congratulate Raghuram Rajanji for the extraordinary range and breadth of insights he has shared with us today. I'm sorry I can't take any more
सर एक
questions.
सवाल हिंदी में ले लीजिए सर, बहुत देर से इंग्लिश के सवाल थे।
देखिए, सही बात है, आप तो पूछ सकते थे पहले, लेकिन अब तो 2 बज गया। आपको पता है कि 1:30 बजे सब लोगों को लंच देना,
छोटा सा एक क्वेरी है,
पूरा दिन बिगड़ जाएगा। माफ कीजिए, अब दोपहर को आपको मौका दे दूंगा।
ठीक सर,
मैं आप देखा हूं कि आप कैसे हैं, मैं आपसे आपको मौका दूंगा। Thank you all very much for this extraordinary session, for all those who contributed with their questions, and Raghu for your amazing insights. Thank you very much. Adjourn for lunch. We're going to shorten lunch by 15 minutes, so you can be back in half an hour to
Sorry,
resume.
ladies and gentlemen, just so that you know, you can exit on the right over here, on this side, for your lunch. It's all the way there in the back. We also have a photo opportunity session with the chairman. Today, that will be with the AIPC East and West zones. Tomorrow, North and South. Today is AIPC East and AIPC West. Your coordinators will be there to help you sort it out. Thank you very much. See you back in 1 hour at 3 o'clock for a session with the Chief Minister of Chhattisgarh. No one on stage, no one on stage.
I'm Shashi Tharoor. I too have been a professional and I'm now in politics. But there aren't enough of us who make that transition. So many people in our country have abdicated the world of politics, feeling that professionals need to study hard, pass their exams, do their jobs, pay their taxes, and leave politics to others. But in fact, if we want our country to benefit from the skills, the awareness, the expertise that professionals can contribute to our country's governance, then we need to see professionals in politics too. I am delighted that the Congress Party has decided to create a professionals' Congress to give professionals a platform and a forum in which they can develop and engage their political interests. The purpose of the Professionals Congress is to allow professionals a way into the Congress Party's deliberations, to give them an opportunity to discuss issues that matter to them, to network with like-minded professionals of the same sort of inclinations, to conduct monitoring of government programs in their areas, to articulate policy suggestions, and to also do their own outreach programs in their areas. A sort of political Rotary club, as it were, for like-minded professionals from around India. The Professionals Congress is intended to be your home. If you are interested, sign up on this site and let us have your support. Join the Professionals Congress. Jai Hind, Jai Congress. Your support. Join the Professionals Congress. Jai Hind, Jai Congress.
कोशिश हमारी पैनल डिस्कशन का मुद्दा भी यही है कि क्या वाकई में सूरत बदलनी चाहिए। जी हाँ, जैसा कि मैंने अपने इस तकरीर की शुरुआत में ही आपसे कहा, जी हाँ, जैसा कि मैंने अपने इस तकरीर की शुरुआत में ही आपसे कहा,
I view the Congress party, AIPC, as a family. When we came in, when we started this conversation, I remember that meeting. What was the essence of it? The essence of it was that there are many, many professional people who cannot find a way into the maze that is called politics in India. That's the what we're trying to do, right? And I can see that you guys have come a long way in navigating that maze and in opening a couple of the doors that need to be opened. And there are different manifestations of it. You've now built a foundation. You now need to scale the foundation. And I don't mean scale the foundation in numbers. So I'm not saying get 200,000 members now. You can scale it in whatever way you want. You can scale it in terms of quality. You can scale it in terms of ideas. You can scale it in terms of impact. But now think about cracking open some of these doors and opening, bigger spaces inside the political maze. Right? That's what happened. So all these people who, Vinoba Bhave, these were all AIPC members. They were talented professionals who were sent in and said, now go to Gujarat, go to Anand. I mean, I know the story of Anand. Anand was basically a British milk company that was ripping off the people of Anand. And Gandhiji sent a professional person there saying, listen, go figure this out, figure out the business dynamics and do something. And he created Amul. Tribhuvan Patel. So realize that that's really your power. So realize that that's really your power. The monopolization of India is almost complete. We are today, I checked and I was like, okay, which is the country that had the highest level of monopolization in modern history? Do you know which country that was? It was Nazi Germany. Right? So please realize that economic monopolization leads to political monopolization. They are linked. The reason the BJP is doing so well politically is because there are economic monopolies that are helping them, who are not helping us. So political concentration follows economic concentration. The monopolization of India is almost complete. We are today, the monopolization of India is almost complete. We are today, the monopolization of India is almost complete. We are today, in our minds, we have that vision. We understand it. Intuitively, we understand it. We know broadly what that vision is going to look like. It's going to have a evolved Manrega. It is going to have an evolved idea of Nyaya. It is going to have It is going to think about making unicorns out of small and medium companies. So it is going to think about how to empower you to become a unicorn, not the other way around. So it is going to think about how to empower you to become a unicorn, not the other way around. In our minds, we have that vision. We understand it intuitively. In our minds, we have that vision. We understand it intuitively.
अरे गौ माता के गोबरला जे सोना कस चमका दे। अरे गौ माता के गोबरला जे सोना कस चमका दे। अरे गौ माता के गोबरला जे सोना कस चमका दे। ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर का काहे सुन लेते संगवारी। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर का काहे सुन लेते संगवारी। अरे किसान मन के कर्जा माफी, भूमिहीन किसान के साथी। अरे किसान मन के कर्जा माफी, भूमिहीन किसान के साथी। 2500 दिलवादिस। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर बेटा है, सुन लेते संगवारी। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर बेटा है, सुन लेते संगवारी। अरे दाई दीदी क्लिनिक लाला के, माँ बहिनी के लाज बचा के। अरे दाई दीदी क्लिनिक लाला के, माँ बहिनी के लाज बचा के। घर घर सब सुविधा देस। ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर भैया है, सुन लेते संगवारी। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर भैया है, सुन लेते संगवारी।
मानेल पढ़ी संगवारी हो, काका है तब भरोसा है। मानेल पढ़ी संगवारी हो, काका है तब भरोसा है।
नरवा गरवा घुरवा और बाड़ी छत्तीसगढ़ राज्य की एक ऐसी योजना जिसने ग्रामीण अर्थव्यवस्था की तस्वीर ही बदल के रख दी है। सशक्तिकरण और प्रकृति को नया जीवन देने वाली इस योजना की गूंज आज पूरे देश में हो रही है। छत्तीसगढ़, जहां प्रकृति ने अपना श्रृंगार खुद से किया है और यहाँ की प्राचीन परंपराएं सदा से ही प्राकृतिक जीवन शैली का राह दिखाते आई है। पर गुजरते वक्त के साथ प्राकृतिक संसाधनों और परंपराओं की अनदेखी ने सब कुछ होते हुए भी छत्तीसगढ़ को प्राकृतिक रूप से कमजोर और समस्याग्रस्त बना दिया था। गिरता हुआ भूजल स्तर, खेती में लागत की बढ़ोतरी, मवेशी के लिए चारा संकट, ऑर्गेनिक साग सब्जी, महंगाई आदि ने स्थिति को और भी भयावह बना दिया था। फिर साल 2018 में प्रदेश की कमान माटी और किसान पुत्र भूपेश बघेल के हाथों में आई, जो ये बात बहुत अच्छे तरीके से जानते थे कि प्रदेश में विकास का सफर ग्रामीण सशक्तिकरण और प्रकृति के रास्ते से ही तय किया जा सकता है। इसके लिए सबसे पहले मुख्यमंत्री श्री भूपेश बघेल ने छत्तीसगढ़ के 4 चिन्हारी नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी एला बचाना है संगवारी का नारा देते हुए नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी योजना की शुरुआत की, जिसका उद्देश्य नरवा नाला, गरवा पशु एवं गौठान, घुरवा उर्वरक एवं बाड़ी बगीचा इनको संरक्षण प्रदान करते हुए इसके जरिए आर्थिक तरक्की का सफर तय करना था। इस योजना के अमल में आने के बाद आज राज्य के सभी हिस्सों में भूजल रिचार्ज हुआ है, सिंचाई और खेती में मदद मिलने लगी है, किसानों को दोहरी फसल लेने में आसानी हो रही है और पशुओं का उचित देखभाल भी हो रहा है। परंपरागत किचन गार्डन एवं ग्रामीण अर्थव्यवस्था में मजबूती दिखाई देने लगी है।
नरवा, गरवा और घुरवा और जो कंपोस्ट खाद बनेगा तो बाड़ी हमारा अपने आप सुधरेगा।
हमारे गांव में गौठान बनी है, बहुत ही सुंदर सुंदर गौठान है
और हम लोग साग सब्जी भी उगाते हैं।
प्रकृति के संग चलकर विकास का ये सफर जारी है। नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी समृद्ध और खुशहाल छत्तीसगढ़ की ये 4 चिन्हारी हैं। कुपोषण को मात देकर आगे बढ़ रहा है छत्तीसगढ़। सुपोषण के जले दीप में जगमगाता रहा है छत्तीसगढ़। हाल ही में राष्ट्रीय परिवार स्वास्थ्य सर्वेक्षण द्वारा जारी परिणाम में छत्तीसगढ़ में कुपोषण की दर 6.4% कम होकर 31.3% पर आ गई है, जो 2015-16 में 37.7% तक थी। वहीं पिछले 2.5 साल में 5 साल तक के 1,60,000 बच्चे कुपोषण से मुक्त भी हुए हैं। एक समय था जब प्रदेश में कुपोषण ने अपनी जड़ें जमा ली थी। ठोस और स्पष्ट नीति के अभाव में कुपोषण से हमारे नौनिहाल ग्रसित होते जा रहे थे, पर एक दिन आया वो समय भी जब कुपोषण के खिलाफ जंग का यलगार किया गया। अक्टूबर 2019 में महात्मा गांधी जी की 150वीं जयंती के अवसर पर प्रदेश के मुखिया श्री भूपेश बघेल के नेतृत्व में मुख्यमंत्री सुपोषण अभियान की शुरुआत की गई। मुख्यमंत्री सुपोषण अभियान के प्रदेश में शुरू होने के बाद से लगभग 4,39,000 बच्चे, 2,59,000 महिलाओं को गर्म भोजन और पूरक पौष्टिक आहार से लाभान्वित किया गया। स्थानीय उपलब्धता के आधार पर महिलाओं और बच्चों को फल, सब्जियों सहित सोया और मूंगफली की चिक्की, पौष्टिक लड्डू, अंडा सहित मिलेट्स के बिस्किट और स्वादिष्ट पौष्टिक आहार दिया गया। मुख्यमंत्री जी के निर्देश पर विगत वर्ष कोरोना काल में प्रदेश में घर घर जाकर आंगनबाड़ी कार्यकर्ताओं और सहायिकाओं ने पूरक पोषण आहार और रेडी टू ईट वितरण कर महिलाओं और बच्चों के पोषण का ख्याल रखा। वहीं वर्तमान में कोरोना की तीसरी लहर को देखते हुए मुख्यमंत्री ने 4% से अधिक कोरोना पॉजिटिव दर वाले जिले, जहां कोविड संक्रमण की रोकथाम के लिए आंगनबाड़ी तथा मिनी आंगनबाड़ी केंद्रों को बंद किया गया है, वहां सभी श्रेणी के पात्र हितग्राहियों को रेडी टू ईट वितरण जारी रखने के निर्देश दिए गए हैं। इसके साथ ही गर्भवती माताओं एवं 3 से 6 वर्ष के बच्चों को घर घर जाकर टिफिन व्यवस्था के माध्यम से गर्म भोजन प्रदान करने कहा है। कुपोषण के खिलाफ जंग जारी है और जंग जीतेंगे भी हम। सुपोषित और विकसित बच्चों का नवा छत्तीसगढ़ गढ़ेंगे हम।
I view the Congress party, AIPC, as a family. When we came in, when we started this conversation, I remember that meeting. What was the essence of it? The essence of it was that there are many, many professional people who cannot find a way into the maze that is called politics in India. That's the what we're trying to do, right? And I can see that you guys have come a long way in navigating that maze and in opening a couple of the doors that need to be opened. And there are different manifestations of it. You've now built a foundation. You now need to scale the foundation. And I don't mean scale the foundation in numbers. So I'm not saying get 200,000 members now. You can scale it in whatever way you want. You can scale it in terms of quality. You can scale it in terms of ideas. You can scale it in terms of impact. But now think about cracking open some of these doors and opening, bigger spaces inside the political mix. Right? That's what happened. So all these people who, Vinoba Bhave, these were all AIPC members. They were talented professionals who were sent in and said, now go to Gujarat, go to Anand. I mean, I know the story of Anand. Anand was basically a British milk company that was ripping off the people of Anand. And Gandhiji sent a professional person there saying, listen, go figure this out. Figure out the business dynamics and do something. And he created Amul. Tribhuvan Patel. So realize that that's really your power. So realize that that's really your power.
अरे गौ माता के गोबर ला जे सोना कस चमका दे। अरे गौ माता के गोबर ला जे सोना कस चमका दे। ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर का है सुन लेते संगवारी। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर का है सुन लेते संगवारी। अरे किसान मन के कर्जा माफी, भूमिहीन किसान के साथी। अरे किसान मन के कर्जा माफी, भूमिहीन किसान के साथी। 2500 दिलवादिस। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर बेटा है सुन लेते संगवारी। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर बेटा है सुन लेते संगवारी। अरे ताई दीदी क्लिनिक ला के माँ बहिनी के लाज बचा के। अरे ताई दीदी क्लिनिक ला के माँ बहिनी के लाज बचा के। घर घर सब सुविधा दे। ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर भैया है सुन लेते संगवारी। ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर भैया है सुन लेते संगवारी।
मानेल पढ़ी संगवारी हो, काका है तब भरोसा है। मानेल पढ़ी संगवारी हो, काका है तब भरोसा है।
अरे गौ माता के गोबर ला जे सोना कस चमका दे। अरे गौ माता के गोबर ला जे सोना कस चमका देस ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर का काहे सुन लेते संगवारी, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर का काहे सुन लेते संगवारी। अरे किसान मन के कर्जा माफी, भूमिहीन किसान के साथी, अरे किसान मन के कर्जा माफी, भूमिहीन किसान के साथी, 2500 दिलवा देस ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर बेटा है सुन लेते संगवारी, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर बेटा है सुन लेते संगवारी। अरे ताई दीदी क्लिनिक ला के माँ बहिनी के लाज बचा के, अरे दाई दीदी क्लिनिक ला के माँ बहिनी के लाज बचा के, घर घर सब सुविधा देस ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर भैया है सुन लेते संगवारी, ओ सीएम नहीं है, मोर भैया है सुन लेते संगवारी।
मानेल पढ़ी संगवारी हो, काका है तब भरोसा है। मानेल पढ़ी संगवारी हो, काका है तब भरोसा है।
नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी छत्तीसगढ़ राज्य की एक ऐसी योजना जिसने ग्रामीण अर्थव्यवस्था की तस्वीर ही बदल के रख दी है। सशक्तिकरण और प्रकृति को नया जीवन देने वाली इस योजना की गूंज आज पूरे देश में हो रही है। छत्तीसगढ़, जहां प्रकृति ने अपना श्रृंगार खुद से किया है और यहाँ की प्राचीन परंपराएं सदा से ही प्राकृतिक जीवन शैली का राह दिखाते आई है, पर गुजरते वक्त के साथ प्राकृतिक संसाधनों और परंपराओं की अनदेखी ने सब कुछ होते हुए भी छत्तीसगढ़ को प्राकृतिक रूप से कमजोर और समस्याग्रस्त बना दिया था। गिरता हुआ भूजल स्तर, खेती में लागत की बढ़ोतरी, मवेशी के लिए चारा संकट, ऑर्गेनिक साग सब्जी, महंगाई आदि ने स्थिति को और भी भयावह बना दिया था। फिर साल 2018 में प्रदेश की कमान माटी और किसान पुत्र भूपेश बघेल के हाथों में आई, जो ये बात बहुत अच्छे तरीके से जानते थे कि प्रदेश में विकास का सफर ग्रामीण सशक्तिकरण और प्रकृति के रास्ते से ही तय किया जा सकता है। इसके लिए सबसे पहले मुख्यमंत्री श्री भूपेश बघेल ने छत्तीसगढ़ के 4 चिन्हारी नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी एला बचाना है संगवारी का नारा देते हुए नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी योजना की शुरुआत की, जिसका उद्देश्य नरवा नाला, गरवा पशु एवं गठान, घुरवा उर्वरक एवं बाड़ी बगीचा, इनको संरक्षण प्रदान करते हुए इसके जरिए आर्थिक तरक्की का सफर तय करना था। इस योजना के अमल में आने के बाद आज राज्य के सभी हिस्सों में भूजल रिचार्ज हुआ है, सिंचाई और खेती में मदद मिलने लगी है, किसानों को दोहरी फसल लेने में आसानी हो रही है और पशुओं का उचित देखभाल भी हो रहा है। परंपरागत किचन गार्डन एवं ग्रामीण अर्थव्यवस्था में मजबूती दिखाई देने लगी है।
नरवा, गरवा और घुरवा और जो कंपोस्ट खाद बनेगा तो बाड़ी हमारा अपने आप सुधरेगा।
हमारे गांव में गोठान बनी है, बहुत ही सुंदर सुंदर गोठान है,
और हम लोग साग सब्जी भी उगाते हैं।
प्रकृति के संग चलकर विकास का ये सफर जारी है। नरवा, गरवा, घुरवा और बाड़ी समृद्ध और खुशहाल छत्तीसगढ़ की ये 4 चिन्हारी हैं। कुपोषण को मात देकर आगे बढ़ रहा है छत्तीसगढ़। सुपोषण के जले दीप में जगमगाता रहा है छत्तीसगढ़। हाल ही में राष्ट्रीय परिवार स्वास्थ्य सर्वेक्षण द्वारा जारी परिणाम में छत्तीसगढ़ में कुपोषण की दर 6.4% कम होकर 31.3% पर आ गई है, जो 2015-16 में 37.7% तक थी। वहीं पिछले 2.5 साल में 5 साल तक के 1,60,000 बच्चे कुपोषण से मुक्त भी हुए हैं। एक समय था जब प्रदेश में कुपोषण ने अपनी जड़ें जमा ली थी। ठोस और स्पष्ट नीति के अभाव में कुपोषण से हमारे नौनिहाल ग्रसित होते जा रहे थे। पर एक दिन आया वो समय भी जब कुपोषण के खिलाफ जंग का यलगार किया गया। अक्टूबर 2019 में महात्मा गांधी जी की 150वीं जयंती के अवसर पर प्रदेश के मुखिया श्री भूपेश बघेल के नेतृत्व में मुख्यमंत्री सुपोषण अभियान की शुरुआत की गई। मुख्यमंत्री सुपोषण अभियान के प्रदेश में शुरू होने के बाद से लगभग 4,39,000 बच्चे, 2,59,000 महिलाओं को गर्म भोजन और पूरक पौष्टिक आहार से लाभान्वित किया गया। स्थानीय उपलब्धता के आधार पर महिलाओं और बच्चों को फल, सब्जियों सहित सोया और मूंगफली की चिक्की, पौष्टिक लड्डू, अंडा सहित मिलेट्स के बिस्किट और स्वादिष्ट पौष्टिक आहार दिया गया। मुख्यमंत्री जी के निर्देश पर विगत वर्ष कोरोना काल में प्रदेश में घर घर जाकर आंगनबाड़ी कार्यकर्ताओं और सहायिकाओं ने पूरक पोषण आहार और रेडी टू ईट वितरण कर महिलाओं और बच्चों के पोषण का ख्याल रखा। वहीं वर्तमान में कोरोना की तीसरी लहर को देखते हुए मुख्यमंत्री ने 4% से अधिक कोरोना पॉजिटिव दर वाले जिले, जहां कोविड संक्रमण की रोकथाम के लिए आंगनबाड़ी तथा मिनी आंगनबाड़ी केंद्रों को बंद किया गया है, वहां सभी श्रेणी के पात्र हितग्राहियों को रेडी टू ईट वितरण जारी रखने के निर्देश दिए गए हैं। इसके साथ ही गर्भवती माताओं एवं 3 से 6 वर्ष के बच्चों को घर घर जाकर टिफिन व्यवस्था के माध्यम से गर्म भोजन प्रदान करने कहा है। कुपोषण के खिलाफ जंग जारी है और जंग जीतेंगे भी हम। सुपोषित और विकसित बच्चों का नवा छत्तीसगढ़ गढ़ेंगे हम।